Hi everyone. My final presentation is on the impact of snares on chimpanzees and conservation efforts. And this is my second semester taking current issues. My first semester, my presentation was on threats facing Florida manatees. And just a brief introduction to the topic. There are many threats that face chimpanzees, including habitat loss, pet trade, illegal hunting, disease, and snare traps, among others. Snares pose a risk to chimps as they can get caught in them and as a result injure their fingers, feet, hands, and toes trying to escape them. Snares are used by hunters for catching small game. On the bottom, the far left image is one example of what a snare can look like. And then in photo A, you can see that Lita lost her foot, and in photo B, Peterson has remnants of a wire snare on his finger, and you can actually see the damage that the snare has caused. And then why should we care about this? Humans share 98.8% of our DNA with chimps, and chimps are currently listed as endangered. They're endangered mostly due to human activities. Therefore, it should be our job to help restore their populations. So I'm going to do a deep dive into the Matani et al. Study, and so this is the method section. The Matani et al. Study looked at removing snares as a conservation tool. This was an observational study. The study started in June 1995 and took place in Kabale National Park in Uganda in the Ngogo research area. During the 321 months of the study, 258 chimps were observed. The chimps are individually identifiable with each chimp given a name. The area was monitored daily by international and local researchers. After almost 27 years of observing chimps within the study, they were able to differentiate between a chimp-related injury and a snare-related injury by observing snare-related injuries in real time. Chimps can have remnants of snares for days or weeks, which can result in severe injuries like loss of digits or limbs. The hypothesis to be tested, in my opinion, this isn't from the paper, this is just my kind of interpretation, is the removal of snares has a positive impact on chimp populations. And then the rationale for the methods, researchers must be able to differentiate each individual chimp. Researchers are humanizing them by giving them names and helping to distinguish them from each other. Since this is an observational study over multiple years involving different researchers and government officials, there needs to be a common identifier for all chimps, which would be their name. And then continuing with the methods from the Matani et al. Study, they started a snare removal program in January of 2011. There were 8 two-person teams, which total 16 people, that operate across the park and remove any snares that are found. Because of this program, snares are rarely found inside of the Ngogo chimp territory. 195 snares were removed in the first year, and 286 snares were removed the following year. All right, so now we're going to move into the results section from the Matani et al. Study. This is the only table and the only graphic in the results section. There were no graphs. This basically classifies each individual, their sex, the year that they were snared, the estimated age at the time that they were snared, and then whatever the snare injury is. And you can see that there are quite a bit that were snared before the study even started. Prior to the start of the study, 17 chimps were noted to have injuries consistent with snares. This represents 18% of the individuals they were able to identify in the Ngogo community. The majority of the injuries happened to adults, but there were 2 adolescent males, Richmond and Waller. Richmond and Waller are about a third of the way down. Richmond is first, and then a few lines below Richmond, you'll see Waller. And if you've seen Chimp Empire on Netflix, you'll recognize some of these names on this list. Richmond has no right hand, Waller has no left hand. Both of these injuries occurred prior to the start of the study, and the estimated age at the time that they were snared is unknown, and you can see that in the table. Okay, so a little bit more results from the Matani et al. Study. In the 14 years prior to the snare removal program, 11 chimps were caught in snares. 7 female chimps that were previously snared moved into Ngogo territory during the study, suggesting that there are snares throughout Kabale National Park. In the almost 13 years after the snare removal program was initiated, only 1 chimp was snared. There has been a 93% reduction of chimps snared after the introduction of the snare removal program. My interpretation of the results is that the snare removal program helped reduce the amount of chimps injured by snares, and my conclusion based on the results is that we need to expand the snare removal program outside of Ngogo and remove snares to prevent more chimp injuries due to snares. So I was able to find a similar study to the Matani et al. Study. It is the Kiwat, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, et al. Study. That study was done in 2002. The Matani study was done in, was published in 2024. For the Matani et al. Study, finger and hand injuries were among the most common. 12 out of 39 chimps, that would be the sample size, 39, lost at least one finger as a result of snares, which is 30.7%. For the Kiwat et al. Study, they found that loss of fingers was the most common type of injury. 11 out of 422, 422 is a sample size, lost at least one finger, which is 2.6%. In terms of hand injuries, the Matani et al. Study found that 6 out of 39 chimps lost their hand, that's 15.4%, while the Kiwat et al. Study found that 9 out of 422 chimps lost their hand, which is 2.1%. The higher percentage of chimps losing their fingers and hands in the Matani et al. Study can indicate that more snares are being used now than there were back when the Kiwat study was done in 2002. 2002. The Matani et al. Study, some limitations were there was a small sample size, there were only 39 chimps, and then fearful chimps may avoid humans and may not be identified or observed for days or weeks at a time, which could alter the results of the study. A criticism was that there was no statistical analysis, there were no graphs of the results, and there was a very limited results section that I felt like could have been more thorough. Some strengths. Most of the sections of the paper were very thorough, specifically the methods section, but also the intro and the discussion. Also, the study duration was almost 27 years, with almost 14 years with the snare removal program in place. The Kiwat et al. Study, some limitations were that researchers sent out a questionnaire to colleagues, and these individuals in the 10 different study sites could hold a bias or different experiences involving snares and chimps that could affect their analysis and judgment. And then a criticism is that the researchers did send out a questionnaire to their colleagues to identify snare-related injuries, but these researchers didn't define or set any kind of standard as to what their definition of a snare-related injury was or looked like. So there was no standard for these researchers to base their judgments off of. A strength was that the Kiwat et al. Study had a much larger sample size of 422 chimps when compared to the Matani et al. Study, which had a sample size of 39 chimps. So how can we prevent snare injuries to chimps? A study by Federic, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, found that warning signs displayed in areas where snares are known to be present was effective in preventing hunters from placing snares in these areas and reduced the overall amount of snares that were found and placed. In addition to the warning signs, the Federick et al. Study mentioned that the use of camera traps may be helpful to help identify these poachers and or hunters. And then educating the community on the harmful effects that snares can have on wildlife is also an important piece to this as well. Some conservation efforts that we can do to help prevent snare-related injuries. We need to continue to remove snares from the environment, especially in areas where the chimps live. Community involvement is also very important. When the community is involved, they feel more knowledgeable and empowered to help in these conservation efforts. Community education is also very important. And community education is actually vital in order for us to achieve any of our conservation goals. And then from a study by Chancellor et al., they mentioned that educating in schools with a focus on preserving and restoring ecosystems can also be helpful. And then a study from Chesney et al. In 2020 actually talked about ecotourism and how that can help benefit with like economic development and help increase awareness and knowledge of ecosystems and the threats that they face. And that can also help with the chimps and preventing the snares in chimp territories. And then my conclusion is chimpanzees are being harmed by humans who are setting up snares near their territory. The snare removal program proved to be successful at preventing chimp injuries related to snares. Humans can have a positive impact on the lives of chimp populations by avoiding the use of snares. And programs like the snare removal program can and should be implemented in other chimp populated areas. These are my image references. And these are my article references. Thank you for watching. I hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and let me know if you have any questions.